hilariously, I just did a whole show to no one. However, I can see the live thing up in my top left thing there, so I am suitably assured that I am now broadcasting to the internet. So if anybody feels the need to drop in a comment and say, hey, I'm watching this, massively reassuring. So, take 2. Welcome to Mondo Murder Party. This is an episode 0, a in-between between Season 1 and Season 2 of Mondo FunnyBooks. I'm going to be posting this when it is fully recorded and uploaded to YouTube to a variety of groups, so I should give you some background information in case you don't know who I am or what my qualifications are to be talking about the stuff I'll be talking about tonight. So, hello, I am Filthy Nevs. I am the infamous veteran of British comics. In my time, I've worked for, well, let's take it chronologically. My first professional job in comics was working at UCAC, 1993 or 1994, a long time ago. I worked for every single UCAC subsequent to that. I also have worked for, chronologically, 30th Century Comics, A Mighty World of Comicana, Comic Showcase, Orbital, Gosh, Raygun, and Raygun East. Also having spent time working for Humanoids, and No Brow Publishing, and, Too Low FPS. How do I... okay. Well, I'm moving quite slowly. Sorry about this. How can we help? Well, you told me. Let's go with that. Okay. I have now done that. Okay, luckily this is all happening in the introduction bit, so we should be alright. Okay, give us a shout if I'm accessible, watchable, viewable. Diddle-oo. So, that's who I am, that's what I've done. I've also been a table monkey for the likes of Dave Taylor and Janine Van Moosel and Mike Lake. So, Season 1 of Mondo FunnyBooks ended quite abruptly, but necessarily, I think. Not at the time, I didn't think it was, but the time away from doing the show gave me a chance to stop and think about what it was I wanted to do. The first season was very much about trying to get myself across as a character and a persona, but I've come to realise, like, this isn't me dressing up, right? This is just how I look, so I probably have enough of a distinctive image to get people's attention to watch stuff, and I probably think I'm knowledgeable enough about the subjects of which I talk about to make my points as necessary. So one of the major considerations I had for the new season of Mondo FunnyBooks was to make it less about Filthy Nevs and more about my understanding of comics history. And what I mean by that is this. I think comics history is very misrepresented. I think it's very corporate. I think it does more to glorify various publishers and creations than it does to actually go into the personal history, the story of the people behind the comics, to explain why things happened the way they did, to explain why Image Comics happened. I think is probably quite a significant part of how comics are today, because the formation of Image creates a massive domino effect which changed everything, and we still feel the effects today. It's only been 2 years since there was only one major comics distributor for, best part of 20 years, well, best part of 30 years as it goes. So yeah, that kind of stuff. And the other thing that really made me rethink what I wanted to do about this was a status that Bill Sienkiewicz posted on Facebook, which has now been deleted or withheld by Facebook anyway, because I can't seem to access it now. And according to him, he's been reported for hate speech, but it was his written reaction to Comicsgate, and it occurred to me that's the sort of thing I think needs documenting. So what I want Mondo FunnyBooks to be going forward is a ongoing document of significant moments in comics history, which may not necessarily fit the official history, but they did happen, and the things that happened as a subsequence of those events are still felt today. So today we are focusing on Frank Miller's keynote speech given at the Diamond Retailer Seminar on June the 12th, 1994. So this is your cue to get yourself a cup of tea or some biscuits, because this is a long one. So yeah, just gonna have a sip of my drink and then we'll get started. As ever, this show is illegitimately sponsored by Rockstar. Rockstar, it keeps me awake. Also, as I mentioned on Facebook, on Instagram, I found a whole bag of my fuzzy family. I'm not going to use the word furry because I don't want that kind of follow. But yeah, so I found Small Alf, which I'm very happy about. He's the 5th member of the Melmacian family who have made their way into my life and my heart, and he also does a wee dance which goes like this. So that's quite good. So well done. Thank you for your special appearance. No, we're not getting any CGC comics. Also, for those of you who like the comics, well, this guy is he has his own backstory. This is Sock Monkey from the Tony Mackie comic, Sock Monkey. He also appears in a dual form in a comic called Mackie's, which is a cartoon strip. If you put Mackie's, Maakkies, into Instagram, Tony Millionaire runs his own strip there. So you can see the Daily Mackies on Instagram, so I highly recommend that. This particular Sock Monkey has a history. I mean, this story is over 20 years old now, so I can tell. Well, 15 years old. So, back when New Comic Day was Thursday, back when there were only 5 channels and everything was sepia, and artists would paint everything in black and white because they were insane. We would have to get through non-delivery days where we were just manning the shop, and we would invent a number of games in order to entertain ourselves for that 8 hours with nothing going on, no customers. Like most comic shops now just don't open on a Monday, and like Tuesdays were much the same as that. So we invented a game called Long Distance Sock Monkey, and what would happen would be one member of staff would throw this Sock Monkey here to the other end, and you would have to try and catch your man here in the most elaborate fashion possible, factoring in as many forward or backward rolls, or bouncing off the walls, or crashing into stuff as possible. And one day a girlfriend of mine came in and was quite shocked. One, that we were doing this in a professional capacity in the West End, but also because she quite loves the fella. So she bought him for me for my birthday as a kind of like, if he's with you, then he won't be at the shop being chucked around by drunken idiots. So that is how Sock Monkey came to live with me. And he's been there ever since, flying the flag. Pretty quiet fella, but he's done some stuff. So I am now going to assume you've all acquired your necessary beverages and stuff. Sit down, get comfortable, and last thing to say before I get started is this show is dedicated to the memories of Lee Scratch Perry and Charlie Watts, both of whom passed away in the last week or so. Rest in power, guys. You did some incredible work, and the world is much richer for your doing that. So yeah, Stone's t-shirt is on, obviously. So, keynote speech. Now, there are 2... this may well be available online. I haven't looked it up. The easiest way of getting hold of a copy of it would be via the book published by Oni in 1998 as a benefit for the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund. So this contains the original speech by Frank Miller, also some stuff by Neil Gaiman and Dave Sim. It's a pretty good read anyway if you're just interested in the nature of how people have attempted to remove comics from library shelves, or comic shops being busted for the material they carried, especially stuff like the Moondog and Friendly Frank busts, or I don't know if they did they covered the Gush lawsuit with HM's Custom and Excise over the Robert Crumb books. But nonetheless, like, it's one of those things I think people should always have in mind that yes, this kind of thing does happen. People do have a bizarre idea that their own ideology ought to take priority over what other people can and can't read. There's been a lot of cases documented over the years by the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund in a free comic called Defender. All issues, I think, are available on the Comixology website, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, if you're interested in seeing what cases have happened, which comics have been attacked, Love and Rockets and Kevin Keller and Persepolis and Sandman are the most frequent ones, because I think the most famous ones. But yeah, contrary to what I will be reading in a couple of minutes, this thing does happen. So yes, if you want to be learned about it, Defender or the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, as founded by your man Dennis Kitchen, is definitely your best resource. So that's probably the easiest way to get hold of it if you want a physical edition, is this Free Speeches book. You'll know it from the Sin City Frank Miller cover going on there. Just to set the scene before we get going though, as Frank reads this, it's 1994, so we are now a couple of years removed from the great Image Exodus. Marvel President Terry Stewart at the time famously said, I don't think it will make a difference. People are drawn to our characters, not our creators. I think he expected the Image guys to kind of fall flat on their face, and obviously, you know, out of the bat, Youngblood had pre-orders of something like over 1 million. Spawn had 1.5 million. Wildcats did crazy numbers, and all the Image books just sold in that period huge amounts whenever they shipped. Like, they broke the stranglehold that Marvel and DC had on the top end of the industry, where Marvel was always number 1, DC was always number 2. I believe the first time that was broken was the Image Zero month, where 7 different Image books released in that month, in theory, right, came with an Image Zero coupon. So you would clip the coupon from the book, send it off to Image, and Image would send you an exclusive Image Zero comic. So yeah, things were changing quite rapidly. That increased readership and increased interest in comics because of Image, because of the death of Superman, because of the Marvel $1 million print run books like Spider-Man, X-Force, and X-Men, meant there was a lot more money floating around. There are also businessmen speculating, literally buying hundreds of copies of a comic as investment. This is obviously before the crash. Hi Matt, good to see you, thank you. So that's where we are. In terms of Frank Miller, he has just written Spawn 11 as part of Tom McFarlane's response to the criticism that Spawn wasn't very well written. He rang various writers and said, I will pay you to write an issue of Spawn. Most famously, Alan Moore did issue 8, and that led to things like Spawn Wildcats and Spawn Blood Feud, and obviously that would lead to the Supreme stuff. 1963 was already happening, so I've read recently an interview with Stephen Bissett. So there's quite a lot going on. Grant Morrison ended up writing 3 issues, Dave Sim wrote an issue, and Frank would write issue 11, which would then lead to Frank Miller doing Tom McFarlane doing a solicitation for Spawn Batman. Now, this doesn't seem like a big deal here in 2021, where we've had Dark Knight Strikes Back, Dark Knight 3 Master Race, Dark Knight Returns and Golden Child, but in 1994, like, Frank hadn't touched Batman for the best part of a decade. He did Dark Knight Returns, and that was it. And, the first time anybody had seen Frank do Batman in any capacity since year 1, I tell a lie, would be Spawn Batman. So Frank's obviously massively enamoured of what Image represents, what they've done for the industry, and has a lot of faith in them. Again, this is back when I think the idea was, as Tom McFarlane had said at the time, going back to work for Marvel now, doing something like Spawn Spider-Man would be essentially returning to the plantation. This is pre-Heroes Reborn. This is pre-Rob Liefeld on Captain America and the Avengers, and Jim Lee on Fantastic Four and Iron Man. Also relevant to Frank at the time is the release of Daredevil Fall from Grace, which is one more of those Marvel event books where they've realised actually people need a reason to buy the comic beyond just it has Wolverine in it, so they follow the model of Death of Superman, where they say, we're going to do something irrevocable to this character, so it'll be a huge thing, so you should buy this because it's a bit of history, and obviously it'll be worth lots of money in the future. They didn't say the last bit, but it's implicit in all of this stuff, right? So, in Daredevil Fall from Grace, written by DJ Chichester and drawn by Scott McDaniel, in amongst a great many other things, because to be honest, it's a bit of a dog's dinner of a story where there's lots of shit going on at once. Lots of stuff going on at once. They bring back Elektra, which is significant to Frank because Frank's deal with Ralph Macchio, who was the Daredevil editor, and yes, the guy from Karate Kid, first time I've heard that one, is that, you know, he would do Elektra Lives Again as long as that was recognised by Marvel to be the final appearance of Elektra, and they wouldn't use her again in any capacity. And as we'll see in the speech, like, Frank's pretty cognizant of what will go on, but it's still a bit, did you have to? It's basically the Doomsday Clock or the Rorschach of its time. It's like, yeah, you can do this, but it's not like you have a shortage of characters. It's not, I mean, if you go back and read Fall from Grace, it doesn't make a lot of sense anyway, but adding Elektra to this whole mix really does nothing to benefit the story. And the subsequent series by Pete Milligan or even Brian Michael Bendis really are, you know, they're not comics that require them to feature Elektra. There are a number of other women in the Marvel Universe who could have fulfilled that role, and there's really been, much like Norman Osborn, much like Uncle Ben or Gwen Stacy, most of the resurrections that have been done in this period have been fairly pointless, if I'm honest. There's not a great story. The only exception to that, I think, would be Ed Brubaker resurrecting Bucky Barnes as the Winter Soldier. But that is off the point. So, as I said, we're doing the Frank Miller keynote speech from June the 12th, 1994, and while probably the easiest way of getting it outside of downloading it online is this free speeches book by Oni, which I'll hold up again now. The version I'm using is from Hero Illustrated issue 15, with a cover date of September 1994, and the John K, can't remember how to pronounce his name, cover. The reason I'm using this one is, one, the text is a lot bigger, I'm a bit blind in my old age, but also this comes with a series of reactions. Well, the main reactions are from his Legend cohorts, which is the imprint he had formed with John Byrne as a reaction to Image. Also, there are reactions from Jim Shooter, who comes up in the thing, and the Comics Code Authority. As we go through, we'll find out why those are relevant. So what I'm going to do is read the speech, and then I'm going to take a break to have a cigarette, to be honest, and to stretch my legs, because this is a bit of a hefty tome. And then we'll go through the reactions from Legend and from Jim Shooter, and finally the Comics Code Authority. So, of course, because I've already done this tonight, I've now taken out the bookmarks, but we should be okay. So, settle down, children, and we'll begin. Just to find my broken glasses here. And just for a start, I will see what the reactions are. Dun, dun, da, da. Just taking this brief break to see what people have said before I get into the meat of the show. Okay, thank you, Scott. Taking what you said. Right, so now about to start the great reading. Get your tea. Have a brew, stroke a dog. Have a brew, stroke a dog. That should be the show catchline. Right then. So this is, for those of you reading along at home, who's that going to be? Hero Illustrated, issue 15, cover date September 1994. This is page 66. The headline is, "And the Miller told his tale. Frank Miller takes on mainstream comics and stirs up the waters." Editor's note: this was the keynote speech given by Frank Miller at the Diamond Seminar, June the 12th. Let me get started by asking you all to join me in honouring two good men we've recently lost. I'm corny enough about this kind of thing to ask you all to stand up. A round of applause, please, for as dear a friend as comics has ever had, Mr. Don Thompson. And another round. Let's make this an even bigger one. I want the walls to shake this time. For the greatest artist in the history of comics, Mr. Jack Kirby. Well, it's a pretty big room, but I think you did it. They had to shake for Jack, just like they would have on any of his pages, and an age has passed with Jack Kirby. Now, comic folks, we're all fond of naming ages of comics. We've come up with a half dozen in the half dozen years. But a very big age of comics is coming to an end now, and I've got to say, I can't call it the Marvel Age of Comics, because I do not believe in rewarding thievery. I call it the Jack Kirby Age of Comics, and by saying this, I mean no disrespect to the outstanding work of Stan Lee and Steve Ditko and many others. We are in their debt as well. But it was Jack Kirby who defined the style and method of every comic artist who followed him, and there is before Kirby and after Kirby. One age does not resemble the next. The king is dead, there is no successor to that title, and we will never see his like again. There are many others we should honour tonight. Too many, far too many. Comics have been around long enough for us to lose the generation that gave us the art form and the industry that we are all celebrating tonight, and they leave us all with their example of the best thing about our little corner of art and commerce. Their love of comics. For most of you, and for me, I know that love has been lifelong, and to our families, schoolmates and acquaintances, it's always seemed a little unnatural, hasn't it? A little weird. So bear with me as I tell you about Frankie Markham and how I fell in love with comics. I was a skinny kid in grade school, the gangly kind of kid who grows tall too fast and falls down too much playing softball. Frankie Markham was my nemesis. Frankie Markham was mean and ugly and a number of years older than I was. He was a tough-ass farm boy, a bully. He must have been all of 12 years old. You know what I mean. A grown-up. Me? I started out wanting to be Superboy. And my mum was kind enough to sew me a Superboy suit, and I often wore it underneath my school clothes. And only to a crowd like this would I admit that. And then came the day that I had to stop being Superboy. And that was the day that Frankie Markham slapped me around and punched out my friend Craig. He punched Craig so hard it dislodged his braces. Craig was a bloody mess and I was bawling like a baby. It was all I could do, bawl like a baby. And I knew I couldn't be Superboy anymore. It was time for this third grader to grow up, and I did. With a new pragmatic worldview, I did the mature thing, the grown-up thing. I decided I was Spider-Man. Spider-Man had trouble with bullies too. They embarrassed him in front of the girls. They called him names. But he put up with it, concealing the secret of his awesome power. He put up with it and put up with it. Just like me, he put up with it and put up with it until... And now my story moves towards its senses-shattering climax. At least, I wish it did. I'd love to say that I kicked Frankie Markham's ass from Vermont to Wisconsin, but I never did that. I never had a fight with Frankie Markham, and I'd have lost if I had. But I did learn to fight back against the bullies with my fists and my wits, and Spider-Man helped. I gained courage, I learned to control my arms and legs, and I fought back, and somewhere along the line, I even earned Frankie Markham's respect. And Spider-Man helped. It was years later, the last time I saw Frankie Markham. I was driving then, so I must have been about 17 years old. I was driving down some back road of Vermont, and there he was standing by the road hitchhiking. So I pulled over and picked him up and drove him over to some other back road, and while on the way he told me that he'd heard I was moving to New York City and that I was going to become a comic book artist, and he thought that was really cool. So then I let him off. I watched him lumber off down that back road. I watched Frankie Markham lumber off down that back road. My old nemesis. All of a sudden, he seemed sad and small. And not very often at all. I wonder what happened to Frankie Markham. Comics have always been desperately important to me, as a refuge, as inspiration, as a vehicle for my fantasies, and as a career. I know I'm not alone, not in this room, in loving what comics are and what they can do. And it's love that built this industry. Jack Kirby was the brightest and biggest of a generation that brought so much love to the page that our entire industry is built upon it. It was an amazing generation, an epic generation. When you think about what they did, they clawed their way out of the Great Depression. And just this month, we were celebrating how they stormed the beaches of Normandy, beat Hitler, and literally saved the world. And along the way, in their generosity, they gave us the comic book. And now, I'm lucky enough to be a player in this field, to be invited to speak to you all about the future of comics, and I will. But there's no way to talk about the future of comics without addressing the past. There is no way to properly understand where we are and where we are going without looking at it, at where we have been. And our history has been so clouded by misconceptions and outright lies that I have to dispel a few of them just to help us all think straight. Too often our villains have written our history, and it's very important that we keep in mind that up until very recently, everything that has been any damn good about comics has been in spite of the rules, not because of them. Men like Jack Kirby and Joe Shuster and Jerry Siegel and Wallace Wood and Steve Ditko, they brought such generous love to the page and such joy to our lives and so much money to our bank accounts that it is easy to forget, way too easy to forget, that they were treated disgracefully. Ours is a sad and sorry history, and we have to keep that in mind while we're in this room enjoying this. Of broken lives, of suicides, of broken talents, treated like galley slaves, talents denied the legal authorship of what they created with their own hands and minds, ignored and treated as nuisances while their creations went on to make millions and millions of dollars. An industry kept alive by love in spite of all of this. The love that they gave the page is a powerful thing. We must honour our dead, and we must understand our history. We cannot move forward without looking very clearly at where we have been. Misconceptions, and outright lies. And here's a whopper. The dreaded 1950s. Frederick Wertham, The Outside World. It seems a week doesn't go by that I don't sit down with my comic buyer's guide and read somebody somewhere fretting about the almighty outside world and how they're bound to notice our adventures and getting more adventurous. Nobody's come after us in any big way, but there's a little bit of distinctive censorship in the air, isn't there? There's all this noise about Janet Reno and Paul Simon and Beavis and Butthead, and we all know what happened the last time, don't we? The 1950s, with Frederick Wertham and the Senate hearings. They shut us down, didn't they? The outside world went and noticed us. The United States Senate held hearings and decided that comic books caused juvenile delinquency. So we had to institute the Comics Code, right? Our backs were against the wall, right? Wrong. Dead wrong. They did not. The Senate vindicated us. Frederick Wertham failed. This is how screwy our own sense of history is. Most people in comics do not realize that the Senate vindicated us. And after due consideration, the United States Senate decided that comic books were not a cause of juvenile delinquency. We were vindicated. Why, then, the Comics Code? Abject cowardice? Maybe. Maybe partly, but not entirely. We, again, were vindicated. Why did the Comics Code go and adopt a code of self-censorship far stricter than any seen in any entertainment form previously. Why would a healthy, vital industry selling comics by the truckload, hell, by the trainload, go and castrate itself? Why? The answer might make you sick to your stomachs. You see, comics publishers in the 1950s had a problem. And this problem had a name and a beard. His name was William M. Gaines. William M. Gaines was the rarest of creatures, a brilliant publisher. His EC comics outsold everybody else's comics because they were better than everybody else's comics by a long shot. The other publishers could not compete with him. Not fairly, anyway. So they used the free-floating fear of the time to shut him down. If you read the Comics Code, and I have, you'll see it was written with no purpose more noble than driving EC Comics out of business. That was its purpose, and it succeeded at it. Here's just a couple of examples of the Comic Code. General Standard Part A, Paragraph 11. The letters of the word crime on a comic magazine cover should never be greater appreciably in dimension than any other words contained on the cover. The word crime should never appear alone on a cover. Goodbye, Johnny Craig. General Standard Part B, Paragraph A. No comic magazine shall use the word horror or terror in its title. Again, a noble effort, folks. That is why we had that damn stupid comics code for all these years. Not to protect children, not to satisfy the United States Senate, and certainly not to mollify Frederick Werton. We were stuck with the comics code for all those dumb decades because a pack of lousy comic publishers in the 1950s wanted to shut down Bill Gaines. Misconceptions, and that one continues to haunt us because of something that never, ever happened. Our industry cringes like a battered child every time there's a hint of a threat from the outside world. And every few years, the fear talk starts again. Every few years, the publishers of stories about heroes who never give up start whimpering that we should fold up our tents and surrender to an enemy that hasn't even shown up. These days, the fashionable form of self-censorship is a rating system. That's what people suggest. Cover advisories are waved like a magic wand that will chase away the censors. Cover advisories, little apologies printed on the corner of the covers. Nobody will bother us if we apologize. If the stormtroopers come after us, we'll be safe if we say we're sorry. Come on, what kind of self-delusion is this? Did cover advisories help Omaha the Cat Dancer, or Love and Rockets, or Yummy Fair, or any of the other comics seized in these busts? No, it pointed them out to the police, if anything. And that's the first reason why cover advisories are a bad idea. They simply don't work, except to save the censors a little bit time in finding out which books to censor. Please understand, retailers in front of me, I believe that you should know what you're ordering. Solicitation forms should tell you if a given comic might be trouble, so you can make your informed decision in your shop, in your community, as to how you want to handle any specific comic, or if you want to handle it at all, because that is your decision. And it is my duty as a comic creator to put together a comic so that the format, the price point, and the cover honestly represent the contents. It is a matter of choices, both yours and mine, and whether or not we will be left free to make them. I know I am not out there on the front lines of retail like you folks are, and I'm not going to pretend to be. No one is going to storm into my studio to take my brushes and pens and paper away, but we are in this together. When you lose, I lose. If a shop gets closed down, that is one less place that will be able to sell my comics if they choose to. And that is why I am happy to report that I've been given at least some opportunity to help a bit. Dennis Kitchen broke the cowardly tradition of comics history by creating the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund, the first organization designed to fight censorship rather than surrender to it. And Dennis invited me to join his board of directors, and before they had a chance to come to their senses, I accepted the post. We have to be brave when and if the censors come. We have to stand up and stand tough and give the bully a bloody nose. Apologies will only encourage the Frankie Markhams of the world out there to come back for more. And there's another reason, and I believe it's more serious and much more subtle, why cover advisories are the first step towards disaster in our future. We are not part of the electronic media. We do not play Hollywood's games with the censors. We are not bought and sold. We are part of a smaller but better industry, and that is publishing. Bookstores do not and never have apologized for selling books for adults. Writers of prose do not submit their works to a pack of rating system bureaucrats or sit down with their notepad or a computer after they've had a good idea and think, now, am I talking about an R rating here? Book publishers use the First Amendments of the United States Constitution as a shield against censorships, and cover advisories have a corrosive effect. I would be bold enough to say that I believe every time a publisher decides to use one, every time an artist allows one to be on their work, they are, in a small way, cutting away the tether that connects us to the book industry and its First Amendment protection. I believe that a cover advisory is a signal for lazy parents and opportunistic politicians that the comics industry is theirs for the taking. We are better than that, and we have too much love. Bear with me as I get to the broken up bit of the article. Excuse me a second. Here we go. Is this? No. Okay. Sorry about that. Oh, it's an interview with Jim Carrey. Here's the thing. I can't keep my hands off Sin City. I love Sin City. The love that we give the page is a powerful thing, and now I can give the angry fan the answer that I have never given him before. If it's Sin City, I write it. If it's Sin City, I draw it every time. That is a promise. No exceptions, no fill-in issues, no, that's a promise. Just Frank Miller on Sin City. It's a promise I can only make because I own Sin City. The creator is bound to his creation. The creator in charge of his creation. It is better for me, and it's better for you. Misconceptions, outright lies. Too often our history has been written by its villains. Lies. Here's a string of them, all about the same man. Neil Adams is crazy. Neil Adams just didn't like to work. Neil Adams was just being a troublemaker. I can testify as a first-hand witness, if there's ever an accurate history of comics written, Neil Adams will be recognized not just as a brilliant and influential artist, but as a visionary, as a pioneer, as one of the heroes of our field. And if our future is as bright as I can believe it could be, Neil Adams will be appreciated as the man who helped us turn a crucial corner towards that future. I was there. I can testify. Neil Adams recognized that the talent was treated disgracefully. As much as he loved the doing of comics, I've never seen anybody work harder than Neil Adams. Anyone can testify to that. Even the flu didn't stop that guy. As much as he loved the doing and creating, Neil Adams was willing to sacrifice hours and days which built up into months and years of his brilliant career, all to gain some measure of justice for Siegel and Schuster and others. These days cartoonists negotiate how high a royalty is to be paid, not whether or not any will be paid at all. Neil came into a field where royalties were unheard of, a field where publishers routinely allowed original artwork to be stolen or shredded. Did you know that at least one major publisher used to routinely shred the original artwork? Now, just picture the golden age. Think of your favourite artist of the time, like Bill Everett or Joe Kubert or Carmen Infantino, right? Back then, the original artwork was bigger. Now, you just imagine taking this original Joe Kubert page and shoving it into a shredder and watching the little fingers of paper come out of the other end. I have just described to you the first work that one publisher gave to several comic book writers who I know, and that is the business Neil Adams inherited. And he was one of the very few people who helped change all this. Along the way, he taught a younger generation, my generation, that our work was worthy of respect, that our efforts deserved to be rewarded, that our families should not go hungry, while our creations would go on to make millions. He showed me that company loyalty was an oxymoron that only a moron could believe. And Neil had to be very, very patient. We don't really learn what happens until it happens to us, do we? And there's always that little voice in your head that says, that was a long time ago what they did to Siegel and Schuster and Kirby and Ditko. So it's no wonder that a lot of us were surprised that 17 years of loyal service and spectacular sales didn't buy Chris Claremont one whit of loyalty from Marvel Comics. And that was just one of many lessons learned from my generation, and now we've learned them. It's astounding to find out just how many allies Neil Adams had at the time, and how well they disguised themselves. Just for example, a few months ago I read a release from Defiant Comics, and found out that Jim Shooter had spent his whole career fighting for comic creators' rights, and you could have knocked me over with a feather, because I knew Jim Shooter was talented and accomplished, and I had always known he was something to do with the Legion of Superheroes, but I had no idea he was Joe Damsel. Here's one lie you can almost forgive, given the current condition of the source. Marvel Comics is trying to sell you on the notion that the characters are the only important component in a comic, as if nobody had to create these characters, as if the audience is so brain dead that they just can't tell a good job from a bad one. You can almost forgive them this, since their characters aren't leaving them in droves like the talent is. And for me, it's a bit of a relief to finally see the old work made for hire, talent doesn't matter mentality put to the test, and we can see the results. They aren't even rearranging the deck chairs. And by the way, Marvel seems to be treating you retailers, from the things I've been hearing about, I'd half expect that if I snuck past Harry Stewart's secretary through the office and into the boardroom and saw who the real boss at Marvel Comics was, I might just find out what happened to Frankie Markham after all. Marvel Comics has been caught flat-footed and dumbstruck by a sea change in our industry. They are paying the price for separating the talent from the characters, as if one is worth a damn without the other. They are showing why creator ownership is so important, not just to me, that's obvious, but to you as well. And when I'm out on the road at conventions or store signings, there is one question I get asked just about every single time. Comic fans tend to be a very polite bunch, but there's a little bit of anger in their eyes when one of them will invariably stand up and ask, how come people leave comics? We loved your Batman. Why didn't you do like more Year One? And we really loved your Daredevil. Why didn't you do some more of what happened to Matt after Elektra died? There's a whole pile of answers to that one. You run out of steam, you're fighting with your collaborator and it doesn't seem worth it anymore. Blah blah blah, things happen, but the main reason a lot of us leave best-selling titles for work for hire publishers is simple. You get sick of feeling like a schmuck. Don't get me wrong here. Like everybody else of my generation, I knew the score coming in. I knew that I was playing with the company's toys. I knew that any characters I created would be turned into cannon fodder for other people. I knew that when I was promised that nobody else would be allowed to write Elektra, I knew that promise would be kept. Right up until the moment it was convenient for Marvel to break it, which is exactly what they did. And I knew all my efforts wouldn't amount to a hill of beans if some editor wanted my job, or had a buddy who did and just fired me. And don't take my word on that one. It didn't matter how well the book was selling. Heck, ask Chris Claremont, ask Louis Simonson, ask Joe Duffy. I knew all that, and I knew I was strip mining the past instead of building the future. That was the game, and I knew it, and I played it, and I had a ball, but after a while, I did start feeling like a schmuck. So I took the risk, and broke away and signed on with a younger publisher, Dark Horse, one of the several publishers who have come along to offer better terms. Publishers not trapped in the old grab it all, keep it all ways, and I am happier now than I have ever been. Things are on their way to getting a lot better for both of us. But still, the old fearful mindset persists, the old self-contempt. And never has it been more shamelessly displayed in the resentment and hatred aimed at Image Comics. For decades, business practices caused a steady, slow brain drain, driving talent away one by one. One by one, each individual artist more or less replaceable, and there's always new kids who don't know their history to come along and just feed the machine and become another schmuck. And then along comes Ringmaster Todd McFarlane and his amazing friends. Instant millionaires, I'm told. Their popularity at a fever pitch. They had it made. They had money. They had fame. They had no reason to leave except they were smart enough to realize that the best you can be under a work-for-hire contract is the status of a well-paid servant. So they left, and brilliantly, they all left at once. Consider this. Todd McFarlane and his pals turned their back on guaranteed wealth, guaranteed fame. They risked all of that on something that had never been tried before, an imprint that represented a group of talents rather than a bankroll. And it was a gamble. Believe me, it was a gamble. When you take chances like that and you pull it off, later it doesn't seem like that. But I am quite sure Todd and Jim Lee and Rob Liefeld and Jim Valentino and Eric Larson and Mark Silvestri and Willis Portacios all had really long, sleepless nights, wondering if they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. But they gambled anyway, and they won. And along the way, they shattered the work-made-for-hire mentality, showing how completely unnecessary it is. Even more surprisingly, they broke Marvel's stranglehold on the marketplace because the kids went with them. They went with the creator. And people, my peers, fellow artists, fellow writers, hate them for it. I want you to consider this. The best-selling comic in this country, which is Todd McFarlane's Spawn, is creator-owned, and artists aren't celebrating. Too many of us are acting like galley slaves complaining that the boat is leaking. I want you to consider this. I wrote an issue of Spawn, and I got called a sellout. But nobody called me a sellout when I did Dark Knight Returns and made more money from Batman than Bill Finger and Jerry Robinson and Dick Sprang combined. Consider this. Because of Image Comics, artists enjoy new opportunities and are paid better even at Marvel Comics. And nobody has said thank you. So let me be the first then. Gentlemen, thank you. And I'll throw this in. Speaking of one of us who was out in the trenches making these arguments 10 years previously, you're welcome. And now Image has inspired Legend and Bravura, and I'm sure other talent-based imprints to come, and we are heading for better times and better comics. And there are new self-publishers and new publishers ready to offer fair and honourable terms. New homes for new creations in a field that has been starving for something fresh and new. The future of comics. I know this has been a scary time for many of you, maybe all of you. The Marvel age of superhero universes, the Jack Kirby age of comics, is coming to an end. It has gone supernova and burning itself out, beginning its slow, steady collapse into a black hole. But we could not feed off the genius of Jack Kirby forever. Jack the King Kirby is dead, and he leaves no successor, and we will never see his like again. No single artist can replace him. No art form can be expected with more than one talent as brilliant as his was. The rest of us, we will build upon what he gave us. We will bring our best efforts, our own quirky, mischievous and rude efforts. We will screw up or we'll get lucky. We'll do right or we'll do wrong. We will make comics that are diverse and wild, and we will take chances, and we need you to take chances too. When you hear about next week's new work-made-for-hire superhero universe, don't stifle that yawn. Take a chance on the new comics. Look for the ones where the creator has every reason to stay and cannot be fired because he owns it and it is his and it is him. And it is a scary time, because change is always scary. But all the pieces are in place now for a new proud era, a new age of comics, and nothing is standing in our way. Nothing too big, except maybe some old bad habits and our own fears, but we will not let them stop us. We will drop them off on some back road like I did with Frankie Markham all those years ago. And we will not wonder what happened to them, and we will not let them stop us. So yeah, that's Frank's speech from June the 12th, 1994. There was a significant reaction to that. So we will cover what Frank's friends at Legend had to say, what the president of the Comics Code Authority of America had to say, and what Jim Shooter had to say after this short break. I'm gonna go have a cigarette, stretch my legs a bit, and I'll be back in about 5 minutes. That's your cue to make yourself a cup of tea, or whatever it is you do to refresh yourself. Back in 5. Oh, hang on. Hello. Okay. Oh, people are liking the video. Awesome. Thank you very much. Yeah. Back in 5 minutes, where we will go over the reaction to Frank Miller's speech at the Keynote seminar on June the 12th, 1994. For those of you who are coming in late, this is Mondo Murder Party. This is the pilot for Season 2 of Mondo FunnyBooks, and after I finish this show, it will be uploaded to the YouTube channel on the Fandom Iconic channel. So if you want to see previous episodes from this, look up either Mondo FunnyBooks or Fandom Iconic channel on YouTube, and there'll be a plethora of fine material. Till then, see you in a minute. Welcome back. Apparently my copy of Sin City, that yellow lighter, took a dive while I was away. So yeah, get a look at it now. These were the really cool, like, mini Dark Horse editions of the thing. So just before I start on the next bit, just wanted to tell you what's coming up with the show. Season 2 is going to be a lot more like this. I think that I kind of enjoy doing the research and bringing to life the bits of history of comics that I think are sadly neglected in a more corporate age. So yes, so to come up, let's see, there's going to be an episode on Roger Corman's Cosmic Comics with a special guest who worked there at the time, just adding some commentary. I'm going to do a retrospective of the comics anthology A1, which one of those books that really should be regarded more. I keep meaning to message one of the people involved and saying, hey, can you give me some insight in what happened now that all the bodies are buried, I guess. So that's on my list of things to actually two people. I might try and do it as a please kill me thing, where I take one account and take another account, and whether they contradict each other or not, I will run them as a objective observer. There's the infamous Grant Morrison and Mark Miller interview with Comics World regarding Skrull Kill Crew, which is one of the funniest things ever written. I'm absolutely sure I'm probably the only person who remembers. There will also be a reading of the Barry Windsor Smith interview with the Comics Journal, which was meant to be promoting his book Storyteller, but remains one of the funniest things ever written in the history of just comics. Sorry, is this a story about a particular Image comic that he did that's making me chuckle thinking about it now? So yes, there's a lot coming up, and one more thing to come, but I will save that announcement for the very end, because I'm kind of hoping one of the people I asked to do a trailer for it will send it to me. Hint, hint, blue-haired lady, hint, hint. So yeah, that's what will be coming up when Season 2 starts properly, and I stop playing about with silly episode things like Episode 0 and Episode Half, because there's only so many variations on a theme that you can do. I don't think there were many otherwise. I can't use Wizard Half, because they probably still are a legal company that does stuff. Oh yeah, they do the Comic Cons, don't they? So, let me just have another swig of my drink, because my throat's a bit dry now from all that reading, and stretch, trying not to fall off the bed. Hello, no loss of life there. So yeah. As said before, this show illegitimately sponsored by Rockstar. Rockstar, it keeps me awake. So put back the bins, as my dad would have said. And we'll cover now the reaction to Frank's great speech. See, there used to be one of the good things about Hero was a column called Hero Insider, which was like insider gossip, and it would all be these coded messages saying what's coming up and all that. And I think there was an issue where it was published like a week after this speech was put out, and yeah, the reactions were a lot more raw than this. So hopefully I will be able to track it down and put that as a kind of addendum, a footnote episode to this one. So, first we're going to do the reaction from the Legend guys, because yeah, they were mainly there. Like, there was a Marvel table and there was a Dark Horse table, because Legend was still quite a new thing. I think, well, X-Men had been going before that, but had become assimilated into this Legend brand thing, as had Concrete and Frank Miller of Sun City, obviously, and Mike Allred was just added to the lineup. So we start off with Mr. Allred. If you don't know about Mike Allred, he is one of the best comic creators out there. I fully credit him with the renaissance of the Batman 66 franchise, because he did mock-up art for a Batman 66 comic, which became part of his solo thing, and it was that pop art style that he brought back, and all of the cool stuff like Alan West and Burt Ward and Eartha Kitt and Cesar Romero that made DC go, actually, people seem to really like this, which leads to the use of the imagery and the songs in the Lego Batman game, and the re-release of the DVD and all the toys and all that. So, and beyond that, Mike's a great comic creator in his own right. He's done books like Madman, where he's famously also Go-Go Robot, Bug, Superman, Madman. God, there are tons of stuff that I'm forgetting, quite embarrassingly. The Vertical, that was a particularly good one. The Everyman, Creatures from the... Anyway, so this is what this is what Mike has to say in response to Frank Miller's speech. Overall, I was filled with this incredible, first, a sense of pride that I knew Frank, and that I was in some way associated with him. No matter what side of the fence you were on, it would be hard to disagree with most of what he said. But what I got out of it that moved me the most was the moment where he simply expressed his love for comics. And at that moment it was a revelation, and I realised that's what we have the most in common. R. Adams of Monkey Man O'Brien, Ultimate X, Gen X, Gen 13. God, that's an obscure one. Lots of good stuff. Adams has to say this. I thought Frank did a great job. I agree with just about everything he said, and he looked so kissable. So there you go. Mike Mignola of, well, lots of good things and lots of obtuse things. Obviously Hellboy is Mike's major contribution to the field of comics, but also he's got lots of weird little odd bits and pieces around there, like a DC miniseries called Cosmic Odyssey from the early 90s, and a Wolverine graphic novel called The Jungle Adventure, which I think is either was or is considered the first appearance of Wolverine's kid Dakan. Yeah, it's Wolverine fighting in the Savage Land with Apocalypse, and there's some female nudity, so it's basically Wolverine as Conan versus Apocalypse. Not bad. So yeah, here's Mike's view. I thought that there was a lot of stuff there that needed to be said, that everybody had been talking about, but nobody really got the chance to say in a public forum. I mean, who could disagree with him? The facts were there. There are people going to say it was in bad taste. It was this, it was that. But you can't argue with the factual information Frank was putting across. We were sitting next to the Marvel table, so we had a hell of a view, and it felt like there was a vacuum in the room. They weren't even talking among themselves. Where I was sitting, I had my back to the Marvel table, so I was very aware that me and all of my friends at Legend and Dark Horse were having a very good time. And then I happened to look back over my shoulder at a bunch of guys, not even looking at each other, and pinned to their seats. I mean, I've had to do a couple of retailer things in my time, and they're not normally that exciting. They're mainly, here are the variants we are going to offer. Really, can we have a chat about, like, the state of your publishing? No, we're just telling you about the variants. Oh, okay, great. So yeah, I'm just having to skip forward and filling for time. The penultimate one is by Paul Chadwick. Paul Chadwick's main contribution to the comics field has been the beautiful series Concrete, which is about a bloke who is kidnapped by aliens and then encased in a bodysuit that is made of concrete. Like, he's 12 foot tall, he has no feelings anymore because he's made of concrete. It is fantastic, heartbreaking, enlightening, soul-affirming, and beautifully done. Paul has also done Superman story for one of the Christmas books from the mid-80s, and the storyboard artist on Pee Wee Herman's Big Adventure. So yeah, Paul, super talented bloke. So yeah, this is what he had to say. Well, our jaws were on the floor. It was great. It reminded me of that truth-telling scene in The Bonfire of the Vanities, which is a novel by Tom Wolfe, where this award-winning poet, a sort of allegorical character, who is dying of AIDS, sort of gives the final word on the decade of greed at this polite dinner party. You have to hand it to Frank. It is one thing to worry about making your speech as you may look silly or something. It's quite another thing to tell the bold truth about comics, which is a pretty ugly truth. to some people who are really going to get upset, and he bit the bullet and he did it. And finally, we have Matrix and Shaolin Cowboy and Hard Boiled and Big Guy and Rusty the Boy Robot Artist. Jeff Darrow. Jeff Darrow's work is like the peak of American comics. I think he's in that upper echelon. One of those guys who makes the rest of comics look bad in comparison, because he's that good. He's like, Jeff does this, and then there's everything else. So, yeah, I cannot recommend his work enough, really. So the main thing I will say is Hard Boiled, which is a very, very simple story. Is hours of reading, because Jeff is like some like Norman Rockwell crossed with the guys from the early 80s, late 70s era of heavy metal, where he just creates these humongous tableaus, where, yeah, there's one focal point and a character is walking forward and firing a gun at a door or something, but the background is filled with so many background characters, and they all have little stories going on. It's one of those things I've been really tempted to do. It's just like create a series of short stories based on the background characters in a Jeff Darrow novel, bit of artwork, because the material's there. Like, he's that good at body language. Yeah, cannot recommend enough. Shaolin Cowboy is his main thing. So this is what Jeff had to say. I was a little concerned about the lack of circulation in Marvel President Terry Stewart's face, but not overly concerned. I mean, he sort of stopped moving. Maybe he had a stroke. But the entire Marvel table had just stopped breathing. It was like Galactus, sucking the power and the life right out of them. So yeah, that's all the fours. So in the speech, Frank made an allusion to Jim Shooter perhaps not being as on side of creators' rights as he suggests in the press release for Defiant, which was a company he started up either before Broadway. So he was unceremoniously booted out of Valiant, I think. I wouldn't swear to it. I'm sure I'll get an angry email from Jim saying, oh, actually this. But nonetheless, at some point he ends up leaving Valiant, and he starts up Defiant, and then, no, it is Defiant, because we were all making jokes about the amount of green neon ink at the time, and then there was Broadway. So yes, this is his second company after leaving Marvel. Note, when Frank announced plans to run Frank Miller's speech, we offered two of Miller's subjects, Jim Shooter and Michael Sickerbock, the chance to respond. Shooter responded by sending us the preamble to the Defiant presentation at Diamond Comics Distributors Inc. retailer seminar. So Jim has not created a bespoke response to what Frank had said at the speech. He has simply sent the press release, which was already available as part of the Diamond retailer seminar, which reads as follows. First, when I became editor-in-chief of Marvel Comics in 1978, I'd been a creator for 12 years. I knew what the problems were. In those days, comics creators performed work made for hire for a small flat rate per page. Period. No rights, no benefits, no nothing. I took the editor-in-chief job with the condition that I would be allowed to make changes, and I initiated the following. Vastly increased rates, quickly quintupled in some cases. Free major medical for freelance creators, free life insurance for freelance creators. The first cash incentive program for freelance creators. DC responded with a more comprehensive royalty program. We then replied to that with an even better royalty program. Creator royalties on the use of characters whether or not the creator worked on that issue. All creators' business expenses, phone, travel, postage, would be paid for by Marvel. All art supplies would be provided free by the company. Proper credits on the work. Improved artwork return. When I arrived at Marvel, some pages were returned to writers. probably because the original program was instituted by a writer. Well, I fixed that. Return of the original artwork to creators like Steve Ditko, Joe Sinnott, Dick Ayers, and others. Everybody but Jack Kirby. Jack was engaged in a legal proceeding against Marvel, so his artwork became a pawn in the legal chess game. I tried to help Jack from the inside, but that situation was pretty much in the hands of upper management and lawyers. Of course, comic fans had no idea who Shelley Feinberg, Jim Galton, and Joe Calamari were. The name they knew was just mine. So it was always, why won't Jim Shooter give Jack his artwork? Well, it was out of my control. Unfortunately, I wish I could have done more for Jack, and I certainly tried. I didn't invent the idea of creators' rights. I certainly wasn't the only one who contributed to the cause. I didn't get the job done by all means. It was and remains an ongoing fight. Other people outside of Marvel, notably Neil Adams, were very vocal on the subject of creators' rights. I did most of my fighting less publicly, in the executive offices and boardrooms. I think it would have been dishonorable and hypocritical to be publicly denouncing Marvel while cashing their paychecks. And although it wasn't easy, some of the boardroom politics and battles got very heated and ugly. For a long time, I was making progress. But then Marvel was bought by CMI, and later by New World Entertainment. Progress stopped entirely, and eventually that led to my leaving. Recently, I got a phone call from Barry Kaplan, who was Marvel's chief financial officer while I was there. I told him I'd been accused of overstating my resume, which is, by some people, a crime. Barry, who was in those boardrooms and executive offices with me, said, and I quote, "Kid, if not for you, none of that stuff would have got done. Defiant's deal with creators is fair and honourable. We think it's the best in the business. Most of the creators who work with us could work anywhere they want, and they chose us. And we'll keep trying to make it better, and the fight goes on." So yeah, that's Jim Shooter's response, which was in the form of the Defiant press release handed out to retailers at the retailer seminar, which, thinking about it, it's kind of an odd thing to give out, right? Because we've got this new company called Defiant, so you have Warriors of Plasm and Dark Dominion, which are titles by Ditko and a very young David Lapham that you're trying to promote, right? I don't understand why Jim Shooter offering his point of view, now that he's free to talk about it, on what happened with Marvel, would make any retailer go, oh, okay, then I will order 30 more copies of Warrior of Plasm 1. They're just two completely disconnected entities that ought not to have anything to do with each other. You know what I mean? It's like that press release ought to be something like, we have discovered this incredible talent called David Lapham, who is going to be drawing our flagship title, Warriors of Plasm, for us, and here are some preview pages of his artwork, and we think he's got a great future in the industry. Or we're going to be doing this incredibly elaborate trading cards, this pre-release on this book called Dark Dominion, which will encourage customers to come in and buy trading cards to make up the panels that will go into this album we're releasing. That's the stuff, if you're a retailer, you want to hear, like, what may or may not have gone on in boardrooms that nobody's really able to verify for a company you don't work for. Has, you know, it's got no bearing on the company you now work for. I don't know, maybe there's more to that story, maybe there's more context needed, but in of itself, as a here's our press release, oh, and by the way, here's what I actually did for Jack Kirby while I worked at Marvel, just seems completely irrelevant. I don't know. Anyway, so this is the other response. This is from the Comic Magazine Association of America's president. I'm not quite sure of the pronunciation, so I'm trying to do it phonetically, which is Michael I. Silberkleit. Could be wrong, don't know. Anyway, this is what he had to say in response to Frank Miller's speech. I appreciate the opportunity to respond to the unfortunate remarks regarding the Comics Magazine Association of America and the Comics Code made by Frank Miller at the Diamond Comic Distributors' 11th annual sales seminar held in Baltimore last month. While Mr. Miller is a gifted and creative writer-artist, His speech relative to the Comics Magazine Association of America and the Comics Code distorted the facts and was totally uncalled for. Every historical article I have read credits the formation of the Comics Magazine Association of America, and in particular the Comics Code, for saving our industry in the early 1950s. I remember as a young man hearing my father, Louis Silberkleit, and his partner John Goldwater, the founders of Archie Comics, talking about the seriousness of the Senate hearings and Dr. Wertman's publication, Seduction of the Innocent. I remember hearing stories of magazine distributors returning thousands of bundles of comics unopened. I also remembered going to early meetings of the CMA as a young man and meeting the publishers of all the major comic publishing companies. These individuals were the founders of our industry. Without them, there would be no Marvel, DC, Archie, Harvey, etc. For Frank Miller to say that the CMA and the Code were formed to drive Bill Gaines out of business is totally ridiculous and unfounded. In those days, there were many more comic publishers than there are now, and the horror comics degenerated from the high quality of the EC line to a newsstand full of gore and garbage. The EC comics relied on the artistic design to build atmosphere and mood. Their competitors depended upon the corpses, usually rotting. Those early days were the era of the witch hunts and the McCarthy Senate committees. Some people actually believed communists and other evil people were hiding underneath their beds. Do-gooders accused comics of contributing to juvenile delinquency. A clinical psychiatrist named Dr. Frederick Werton lent his professional credentials to the case against comic books. Dr. Werton was the loudest and most successful critic of the comic. We all know his book Seduction of the Innocent. Few of the founding fathers of our industry are alive today, but if you could speak to a few survivors, they would all agree that the CMAA saved our industry. For Mr. Miller to hold up a copy of John Goldwater's book, Americana in 4-color, and publicly rip it up and throw it to the floor in front of 3,000 people is disgusting and offensive. A creative person like Mr. Miller should respect the creative abilities of others who contributed to writing this book and putting their blood into saving our business, a business for which Mr. Miller has handsomely profited. In those early days, major publishers were all charged with guilt by association. Just the fact that they published comic books, even if they were funny and innocent, was enough to have them banned from the newsstand. There was no direct market. All magazines were sold on a returnable basis. In order to avoid controversy and possible prosecution, magazine wholesalers returned thousands of bundles of comics unopened. What did Mr. Miller expect the publishers to do? The formation of a comics magazine association seemed to be the only alternative, and what's wrong with a code of decency? Again, the code was formed to save our industry, not to purge Bill Gaines. It succeeded against overwhelming odds. It was a matter of economic survival, not simply getting the government off of our backs, but getting retailers to display and sell comics again, and wholesalers to distribute comics widely again. The administrators of the code have always been public relations spokesmen, as well as backroom censors for the comics industry. The code is to the industry what Jack Valentini is to the motion picture industry. Okay, I'm going to butt in here, right? If you don't know who Jack Valentini is, you might want to go get a copy of Hollywood Babylon or Hollywood Babylon 2. And if you read that, I think you might come to think that perhaps that analogy is not as benevolent as Michael thinks it is in its context. Where was I? If there were no code effective tomorrow, in my opinion, most of the stories in comics would remain the same. Editors have come to accept the standards as rational editorial policies. Let's not lose sight of the fact that what was not accepted in the early 1950s may well be readily accepted in the early 1990s. The times are totally different, and the current comics code is a far cry from the code of 1954. But history has a way of repeating itself. We live in a time of violence. The witch hunts can start again overnight, and who is to say that comics won't again become the target? Isn't it interesting that everyone who I have spoken to in our industry expresses their gratitude that there are still decent comics available for their young children to read? Comics like Archie, Harvey Comics, Disney Comics, Barbie Comics, Spider-Man, Superman, Thor and Flash. A more graphic comic should only be for older readers, in my opinion, parental supervision is very important, as it relates to what a youngster reads. I'm not in favour of censorship of creativity. I just feel that certain material published today does not belong in the hands of the very young reader. Let comic readers' tastes mature as they mature. As I said above, much hard work and creative energy was spent by the founding publishers of the comics industry. It is not right that one man like Frank Miller can get up and tear that apart in a speech attacking the comics code. Okay, I might have added my own dramatic reading of the last line there, but those were the responses of the time, unless I can find any more in a video to be added later. So that's it. That's the Frank Miller keynote speech at the Diamond Comic Retailer Seminar of June the 12th, 1994. Obviously things would change quite radically after he wrote that. He has since spoken in regret that he was, as he said, taken in by the Image hype. He was very much of the opinion that the Image guys were staking their claim as only doing Image, that there would be no returning to the plantation, as Todd McFarlane called it. There wouldn't be. He had no idea that Heroes Were Born with Fantastic Four and Iron Man by Jim Lee, or Captain America and the Avengers by Rob Liefeld were on the way, or that Wildstorm would be sold into DC and eventually, become the cornerstone of it, and what was the overriding clique at Marvel in the early 90s, Jim Lee, Scott Lobdell, Bob Harris, would end up, being the main guys at DC much later down the line. Yeah, what do you think? Obviously, this is not a commonly known of document, and obviously Frank Miller said a lot more contentious things then. I find the idea of having the comics code in front of you and ripping it to shreds in front of an audience quite funny. Because having read the comics code, I find it very hard to believe that it wasn't worded in a way to put Bill Gaines out of business. As is well known, the only surviving thing of EC was Mad Magazine, and that was because it was a magazine format thing, so it was not subject to the comics code. But then via the work of mainly Harvey Kurtzman, but also Jack Davis and Wally Wood and a whole host of others I'm sure I'm forgetting, would form essentially the foundation of American humour. The satirical look that became, would evolve into stuff that happened in National Lampoon, and that begets National Lampoon magazine, which gives you Animal House, which gives you the Chevy Chase vacation movies. It's an incredible side effect, for want of a better word, that by simply doing a magazine, you accidentally invent almost a genre of comedy. So yeah, I'd be interested to know what people who hadn't heard that before thought. I'd certainly be interested if anybody was there at the time, had their own recollections of the event and what they had to say about it. I'm not sure if anyone who was working for Diamond then is still working for them now. But yes, and what do you feel? The comics code was effectively retired around 2000 when Marvel pretty much stopped using it, it's a story for another time. I have come to learn via a bit of research exactly what the meeting was that led to the retirement of the code. We do live in an age where there does seem to be, I'm trying to think how to put this, but since the code is retired, there seems to be a desire for some kind of patriarchal father figure to say you've gone too far. But there isn't a map, there isn't a series of guidelines to say you have gone beyond this, beyond the viewer's own personal standards, which are obviously not a thing that can be applied, because even if comics only have at their best 50,000 readers on this end of the spectrum, you cannot take in 50,000 different people's individual standards as your starting point, because there won't be a middle ground. Do we need the Comics Code back? Does there need to be some kind of counterbalance? I know where I stand on this, but this video is not about me. This is kind of, I want to know what people think about this, because I think unfortunately nature does abhor a vacuum, and that amount of power, of psychological control over the content of what would go into a comic designed for the newsstands, where even if people weren't directly aware, they couldn't actually recite any of the Comics Code, that series of standards was so embedded into mainstream comics that it's kind of psychologically implanted, where you just stay within these parameters even if you don't know why those parameters are in your head in the first place. So yes, that has been the show. This has been Mondo FunnyBooks. Frankly speaking, this show will return soon. Oh wait, there was one more announcement, wasn't there? So, speaking of history of comics, as I have said, we'll be covering things like A1, the infamous Skrull Kill Crew interview. I might see if I can find the Summer Offensive interview that Grant and Mark did as well, because that's quite a good laugh. Stripperella episode, which will be essentially me reading the original Mondo FunnyBooks column I wrote about Stripperella. I also have a piece coming up in, I think it's Fanzine, I don't know. I've written for so many magazines now that it kind of like, I guess I'm in that one, which sounds like a humble brag, but it's just what my life is. So yes, thank you very much for watching. And that big news was, speaking of things that belonged in the 90s, because I am a great believer in the idea that the 90s is basically, in terms of comics history, it's a Kennedy assassination, man. So much changes, and you can almost see that meeting with Tom DeFalco and the Image 7 as the equivalent of Kennedy being murdered, because once that happens, so many other things happen. The formation of Image leads to the shift of power at Marvel, where suddenly everything is little fiefdoms, and then you get to the formation of Heroes World as a reaction to the inability to, further pierce the direct market, where Marvel decide they're going to basically, because they can't establish more control over the retailers, they will sidestep the retailers and start directly going to the customers themselves via a thing called Marvel Mart. Maybe I'll do a reading of the Marvel Mart thing, actually, because that is a fascinating piece of just arrogance. And of course, the creation of Heroes World, the purchase of Heroes World, leads to ultimately Diamond having full control over the American comics industry for over 20 years. It's all of that stuff happens in a very short space of time, and while that it isn't on the same level of significance, I am really pleased about this. One of the things that happened in the 90s was a line called Carnal Comics. Now, for the more prude amongst you, Carnal Comics was a line that worked with women working in the adult film industry, the likes of Annabelle Chong and Jana Jameson and Sarah Jane Hamilton, where they would create comics based on them. You've got stuff like Wicked Weapons and Pink Stilettos. Also, very young Holly Golightly of Tarot of the Black Rose fame, who just had her birthday yesterday. Happy belated birthday, Hol. Worked there under the name Mauve before going on to work for Archie, because that's a CV you want. So yeah, I managed to find one of the guys who worked for Carnal Comics, who was a managing editor, called J. Allen Sanford. I said to him, I think your pictures and recollections are fascinating, and I would like to reproduce them both in text and video fashion on Mondo FunnyBooks, and he has agreed. So that will be an ongoing segment in upcoming episodes of Mondo Funny Books Season 2. So that, for those of you who like your funny books different, that will be a thing to look forward to. There are some beautiful photographs to come, I know, because I've already seen them. And it's probably the only time I will tell a story about Kiss in a positive fashion on this channel. So, that has been your show. Thank you very much for watching. Wow, this has been a big one, an hour and a half. So yeah, I'm now going to make a cup of tea and upload this to the internet. Until then, this has been Filthy Nevs for Mondo Funny Books on the Fandom Iconic channel, signing out. Have a good night, guys and boils? Guys and boils, whatever. Anyway, be good, and if you can't be good, don't get caught.